Yo guys, welcome back to a brand new video where today we are going to go ahead and take a look at the Season 27 Ina's Water Ally Monk. Now to see if this build is for you, let's go ahead and dive into some of the pros and cons. Alrighty, to start with the pros, the Monk is probably the best class in the game if you want to clear a GR150 this season. Now, although this might not be the build that you're going to use for the GR150, I believe that it is the fastest build that you can use to get your gear for the Wave of Light Monk to push GR150s. Next up for the pros is that you have a dash that almost kind of works like a teleport. Okay, so here's one example of the dash kind of working like a teleport. As you can see, we don't have to line ourselves up with the entryway. We can basically teleport directly through the wall. Okay, so next up is that this build has phenomenal screen clears. Activating the Mystic Ally ability causes all your Mystic Allies to almost turn into these crashing waves. As you're dashing through the map, they will absolutely obliterate all enemies that are within sight of your screen. Next up is that although we're taking advantage of the Angelic Crucible power, this build is not reliant on it. This will continue to work in non-season and future seasons, so long as there's no changes made to the Ina Monk set. And to round out the pros, I do not believe that there is a single build in this game that has the potential to move faster than this. Especially when you factor in the screen clearing ability and the ability to move so quickly with your dash. I really don't think that there is another build that can get through content as quickly as this. Okay, to dive into some of the cons, the build is reliant on elite density. You need to be chasing after elites and to some extent ignoring trash mobs. Now, it's absolutely worth it to clear big packs of trash, but don't go chasing down packs of 4 or 5. You want to really be chasing down big packs and hunting after elites as quickly as you can. This is because we're using an Ingeom in the cube. When Ingeom is not active, you cannot be spamming dash 100% of the time, which is really going to slow down your movement. Next up for the cons is that you kind of have to know the maps to some extent to play this build effectively. If you take a wrong turn or you go in a circle around one of those circular maps, when this happens, your Ingeom is going to fall off and you're just going to be stuck running from point A to point B as opposed to dashing. Next up for the cons is that this build is hard to control. When you are dashing around so quickly, it's easy to just accidentally dash into a wall and do it again and just kind of get your character stuck. The dash skill is a little sensitive. You have to angle it properly, especially when you're in tight corridors. Otherwise, when you hit it, your character is just going to barely inch forward. This is especially annoying when your Ingeom is not up because you haven't killed an elite yet. And if you do this and you get stuck on some kind of terrain, you've basically then just wasted one of your 2 dashes. And again, you're just going to find yourself running from point A to point B, which is what we want to not be doing with this build. Next up for the cons is that this build took a massive nerf in Season 27. The 6-piece set bonus with the 900% multiplier used to be 3000%. Most players are saying that this is a nerf of about 7 GR tiers, which is absolutely substantial. As a result, this is not a pushing build, so you're going to want to be using this to get your pieces to build up to the Wave of Light set. Let's go ahead and dive into some of the gear. Okay, to start with the helm, we're going to be using the Ina's helm. These are the stats that you're going to want. You're going to want the dexterity, vitality, and crit hit chance. Also make sure that you're getting a max level diamond put in there for the cooldown reduction. Next up are the shoulders. These aren't quite the perfect stats. You would much rather have the dexterity over the vitality. Having said that, the all resist, cooldown, and mystic ally damage are what you want. Next up is the amulet, and we're using Squirt's necklace. Ideally, you're not going to want dexterity. You would rather have cold % damage here. Having said that, crit, socket is correct. Moving on to the gloves, we're going to be using the Frost Burns. We use these for the additional 20% cold damage and the freezing effect that has a 50% chance to freeze enemies around you. These are the stats that you're going to want on these gloves. You're going to want the dexterity, attack speed, crit chance, crit damage. Onto the chest, we're also going to be using Ina's. You're going to want the dexterity, vitality, and mystic ally damage on this piece. For the wrists, we're going to be using Oghild's. You want the cold damage, you want the dexterity, you either want all resist or vitality, and lastly, crit hit chance. For the belt, we're going to be using Ina's. These are going to be the stats that you want: dexterity, vitality, life %, and all resist. For the rings, we're going to be using focus and restraint. I would recommend that if you can, you get average damage instead of dexterity. Having said that, it is difficult to roll these pieces with average damage, the 2 crits, and a socket. So the next best thing to do is to get them just like mine. Dexterity, 2 crit, and socket. The restraint is the same situation. You would rather have the average damage, crit, socket, but dexterity does work fine over average damage. Moving on to the legs, we're going to be using Ina's. You do want the dexterity, you want the vitality, and ideally you would rather get all resist as opposed to the armor that I have on my piece. For the boots, we're going to be using the crudest boots. We are using these for the ability to create 2 mystic allies and increase the damage that they do. Now, the stats that I have are going to be the stats that you want. You're going to want that dexterity, vitality, all resist, and armor. Having said that, if we look at the secondary ability that increases the damage of Mystic Ally, it can roll all the way up to 200%. Don't be like me and use a 159% crudest boots when you're playing this build. Do everything that you can to get a pair that is as close to 200, if not 200% increased damage. And to round the build off, we're going to be using the Ina's Reach for our weapon. These are going to be the stats that you want. 10% increased damage, dexterity, and attack speed, and then make sure you're using the Ramalandi's Gift to add a socket. I would recommend using your Angelic Crucible on this unless you have a very good Ancient roll or a Primal roll. Make sure that your roll on this is as close to possible to that 120% increased Mystic Ally damage if you're not going to be using your Angelic Crucible on this piece. The only other piece that I would really recommend that you use your Angelic Crucible on this season would be the Squirt's Necklace to get an ideal roll. If by some miracle you've got a Primal Ina's and a perfect Squirt's, maybe look to using it on one of your rings or the crudest boots to get that full 200% increase. And as a quick note for the Angelic Crucible, make sure that you get the ability for the Way of the 100 Fists. Now, for our legendary gems, we're going to be using Bane of the Trapped, Bane of the Powerful, and Enforcer, which increases our Mystic Ally damage. Moving on to the skills and passives. For our primary skill and to activate our focus, we're going to be using Way of the 100 Fists. This will help to increase our attack speed and movement speed. Next up is Cyclone Strike with Implosion. This skill is so important. This is going to allow you to pull all enemies towards you when you're doing your burst damage. We're also going to be using Mystic Ally with Water Ally. Now, the entire build is centered around this ability. You're going to want to keep this up as much as possible, and when you're fighting elites, you're definitely going to want to activate it if possible. This is the ability that's going to absolutely clear out screens as you're dashing by. It's substantially less good when it is not active, so try to keep it up as much as possible to make sure that you're clearing screens as you're moving along. Next up is Dashing Strike with Radiance. We're going to be using this to get around as quickly as we can and also to increase our attack speed. Bear in mind when Ingeom is not up, you only have 2 dashes. Make sure that you're centering your character correctly so that you're not getting stuck on terrain, and also be certain that you're not just sitting on 2 charges. Always make sure that 1 charge is at least going at a time so that you're not wasting the recharge timer. Next up is Serenity with Ascension. This is basically here just to keep us alive and to break crowd controlling effects when our Epiphany drops off. And lastly, moving on to Epiphany, we're going to take the rune for Desert Shroud. Now we're using the Desert Shroud to stay alive. This reduces all damage that we take by 50% while Epiphany is up. One really important note about Epiphany is that when we do not have Dashing Strike available, we can click on enemies to dash towards them. This is going to be especially important when you're first starting a rift. When you're out of Dashing Strike charges, this is going to allow you to move from enemy to enemy much quicker so that you can find your first elite pack to get up the Ingeom. Moving on to the passive skills, we're going to start with Unity. This is going to add damage reduction and increase damage to our character. Next up, we're going to be taking Seize the Initiative for increased attack speed. We're also going to be taking Relentless Assault. This allows us to do 20% more damage to enemies that are blinded, frozen, or stunned. As a reminder, we are using the Frostburn Gauntlets so that we can freeze enemies around us to benefit from this passive. And lastly, we'll be using the Beacon of Etar. This build is highly reliant on cooldowns, and so this passive is absolutely essential. Next up is the Cube. As we discussed earlier, this build is made around Ingeom and keeping it up as much as possible. This will allow us to spam our Dashing Strike as frequently as we would like. This is also greatly going to decrease the cooldown on our Water Ally ability so that we can activate it more often. Basically, every single skill on our 1 to 4 bar is going to benefit from Ingeom being up. Next up is Binding of the Lesser Gods. We're going to be using Cyclone Strike to pull in all enemies around us. This is great for grouping elites and large groups of trash, and when we do this, we're now going to gain 200% increased damage. And lastly, we're just going to be using the Ring of Royal Grandeur so that we can benefit from the 3-piece set on the Oghilds and the 6-piece set on the Ina's. Okay, let's quickly cover the follower. Now, I know that my face is blocking some of her skills, so we'll cover those in just a second. Make sure that you're using as much emanating gear as possible, especially including the Flavor of Time and the Nemesis bracers. I like to use the focus that ensures that she does not die. Now, if you get good enough gear on your Enchantress to the point where she is not dying, then I would recommend taking the focus to unlock all 8 of her skills. Make sure that you gear your Enchantress a little bit better than I did, because we have to get to 25,000 intelligence on her. This is going to max out all of her skills that get increased with how much intelligence she has. Now, if you're not using the focus to unlock all skills, let's quickly go over which ones I pick. I take Temporal Pulse, Prophetic Harmony, and for the ones that you can't see, I take Powered Shield and Focused Mind. If you're dying a lot, you can try to take Fate's Lapse over Focused Mind instead. Okay, so let's talk about some of the tips and tricks while playing this build. We briefly touched on this earlier, but make sure that you are focusing on elite packs and not going after small groups of enemies. Sometimes with this build, it's also better to slow down a little bit to actually speed up. What I mean by that is spamming Dashing Strike all the time will often get you stuck. I find it to be a little bit better to get my bearings in order and then use Dashing Strike so that I'm actually getting use out of the skill as opposed to just spamming it and getting stuck on random terrain. Next up is that I recommend that you focus on GR 75 to 100. If you have really high Paragon and you're really well geared, maybe you could go up to 105 or 110. Just make sure that you're clearing them really quickly, because this build has the potential to clear GRs in about a minute when they're really good. Having said that, my average GR 100 runtime is about a minute and a half. My next recommendation is that if you find yourself dying a lot, it's not all that bad to drop Bane of the Powerful to use the Molten Wildebeest Gizzard. Using this gem is going to give you a fantastic Absorb Shield. Now, not only will this keep you alive, but it's going to protect the benefit that you get from your Squirt's necklace. And for my last recommendation, this is generally best for running greater rifts. If you want to do T16 content like bounties or key farming, what I would recommend is that you swap out your Inas for an Echoing Fury and an Ingeom. In addition to that, you're going to want to take the Ingeom out of the cube and replace it with a Flying Dragon. Now, to make it even a little better for Torment 16, you can drop the Oghild set. If you opt to do that, I would recommend using the Warzeshian Arm Guards and Lefebvre's Soliloquy. By dropping the Oghild set and doing this, your Cyclone Strike will now reduce your damage taken by up to 50%. In addition to that, you'll also be gaining move speed because of the Warzeshian Arm Guards. Your active Mystic ally ability is going to be wrecking objects around you all the time. By doing that, you're going to continuously be gaining the burst of speed from the Warzeshian Arm Guards. Alrighty folks, let's go ahead and dive into some gameplay. I'm just going to throw in a couple random runs of running this build on GR100. Well, folks, I hope that you enjoyed the build guide. Go ahead and drop a comment down below and let me know what you think of this build. If you have any tips or tricks for other players while using this build, go ahead and let us know down in the comments down below. As always, folks, I greatly appreciate you for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.